You will marry the Haywood girl, and you will do it before the month is out, or you will watch this house crumble to its last stone. The words hung in the cold morning air of the study at Bramholt, and Selwyn, Duke of Bramholt, did not so much as turn from the window. He stood with his hands clasped behind his back, watching the frost retreat across the lawns, and he let the silence stretch long enough that his uncle's breath grew audible with impatience. That was a habit of his, this silence. Men mistook it for weakness once years ago and had learned their error at some cost. Now they mistook it for arrogance, and Selwyn permitted them the belief, for it kept them at a useful distance. You have nothing to say, his uncle pressed. Lord Auberon Vane was a heavy man gone heavier with the years, and he sat wedged in the chair by the hearth as though the furniture itself owed him tribute. A duke told that his marriage has been arranged over his head, and he stands mute as a footman. Have you no feeling at all in you, Selwyn? I have a great deal of feeling, Selwyn said without warmth. I have simply learned what it is worth to speak it aloud in this room. He turned at last. He was a tall man, lean where his uncle was broad, and there was a stillness to his face that the passing of 38 years had only deepened. Once, that face had been open. Once, it had been quick to laugh, quicker to trust, and it had cost him a wife dead in childbed and a child dead beside her within the same terrible winter, and a woman he had believed he loved who had wept prettily at the graveside and been engaged to a wealthier man before the stones were carved. He had been 26 then. He was a different creature now, and the servants at Bramholt said among themselves that the Duke had buried his heart with his duchess and never troubled to dig it up again. The estate is mortgaged to the eaves, Auberon went on, mistaking his nephew's stillness for attention. Your father's debt's not mine. I have only kept the ship from the rocks these dozen years while you played the recluse in the North Country. The Haywoods hold the notes. Marry the daughter and the notes are forgiven. Refuse her and old Haywood calls them due, and there is not a bank in London that will lend to a name as tarnished as Bramholt has become. So you see, nephew, your feelings, whatever their worth, are a luxury neither of us can afford. Selwyn crossed to the desk and looked down at the miniature that lay there upon a folded letter. It was a portrait no larger than his palm, painted in the flat, competent manner of a provincial hand, and it showed a young woman with brown hair drawn plainly back and a face that the artist had plainly not been paid enough to flatter, Melina Haywood. He knew almost nothing of her beyond her name and her father's fortune, which had been made, it was whispered, in the vulgar business of shipping and coal, and which had bought the family a great deal of land and none of the regard that ought to have come with it. The daughter had been raised, he understood, half in the schoolroom and half in the counting-house, and had been passed over by 3 seasons of London society as too quiet, too poor in her connections, too far beneath the notice of the men her father's money was meant to buy. She is plain, Auberon said, following his gaze with something like satisfaction. You will not be troubled by any excess of admirers. And she is biddable, by all accounts, a mouse of a thing, no conversation, no accomplishments to speak of. You may install her at Bramholt and forget she exists, save when an heir is wanted. It is the most convenient sort of wife a man in your position could ask for. How you recommend her? Selwyn said quietly. Something in his tone made his uncle look up. But the Duke's face gave nothing away, and after a moment Auberon grunted and heaved himself from the chair. Sentiment, he said, is what beggared this family in the first place. Your father married for love and drank the difference. You will marry for sense, as I have arranged, and you will thank me for it when Bramholt still stands to pass to your son. I have not laboured a dozen years over these accounts to see them thrown away on your pride. The Haywoods are eager for the match, eager past all sense, which tells me the old man wants the title for his girl, and does not much care what manner of man wears it. That is your good fortune, nephew, though you are too proud to name it so. A bride bought is a bride who asks no questions. The banns are reed. The cathedral at Ackworth is bespoke. You need to do nothing but arrive on the day and speak the words, and I promise you the girl will give you no trouble at all. He paused at the door. You do not even mean to meet her beforehand, I suppose. To what purpose? Selwyn said. You have told me she is plain, biddable, and silent. You have told me the marriage is a transaction. One does not court a mortgage. Auberon laughed, a short unpleasant sound, and took himself away, and the Duke was left alone with the little portrait and the great cold quiet of the house his forebears had nearly ruined. He did not, in truth, feel the anger he might have expected to feel. He had passed beyond anger some years ago into a country of grey indifference, and it was from that country that he regarded the coming marriage as he regarded most things now, as a duty to be discharged, an unpleasantness to be endured. A door through which he must pass to reach the tolerable emptiness on the other side. He would marry the Haywood girl. He would save the estate that 400 years of Bramholtz had raised and one had squandered. And he would expect nothing of it and want nothing of it, and in that way he would not be disappointed, for he had learned that disappointment was only the debt one paid for having hoped. He set the portrait face down upon the letter and rang for his horse. The wedding was set for a fortnight hence, and Selwyn spent the intervening days as he spent all his days in the management of what remained to him. The tenants, the accounts, the endless small triage of a great house bleeding slowly at every seam. It was on the 9th of these days, in a market town some miles from Bramholt, where he had gone to see about a matter of grain, that the arrangement of his life brushed against him for the first time, though he did not know it, and would not know it for a long while yet. He had left his horse at the inn and gone on foot into the press of the market, hat drawn low, his plain dark riding coat unmarked by any crest, for he had long ago learned that a duke abroad in his own person drew a crowd of petitioners and flatterers, while a nobody in a good coat could move through the world unseen and hear the truth of things. There was a rough pleasure in it that he would not have confessed to anyone, this walking among people who did not know him, who did not weigh every word he spoke for its advantage, who saw only a tall grave man of middle years, and let him be. He had gone perhaps a dozen paces into the crowd when he heard the commotion. A cart had overturned at the corner where the poulterer kept his stall. A light cart, poorly balanced, its axle snapped and its load of winter apples spilling in a bright tide across the frozen mud. The carter, a wiry man with a bad leg, was cursing and clutching at his knee where the shaft had caught him, and the apples were rolling everywhere, and a knot of boys had already begun to snatch what they could and vanish into the throng. The crowd did what crowds do. It parted and flowed and pretended not to see, and a stout woman in a good bonnet drew her skirts aside from the mess with a click of her tongue, and a gentleman stepped neatly over a fallen apple as though it were something shameful, and no one, in that whole moving press of respectable people, stopped. No one, that is, but a young woman in a grey cloak. Selwyn marked her chiefly because she was the only thing in the scene that was still. She had a plain wool cloak with the hem gone thin, and a bonnet some seasons out of any fashion he knew, and she went down on her knees in the cold mud without a moment's hesitation and began to gather the apples back into the carter's broken basket. She was not pretty in any way that the market would have paused for. Her face was too grave, her brown hair too plainly dressed, her hands reddened with the cold, but she worked quickly and without fuss. And when one of the thieving boys ran past her, she caught him not by the collar but by the wrist, gently, said something Selwyn could not hear, and the boy stopped and hung his head, and after a moment crouched down beside her and began to put the apples back. "There's a good lad," he heard her say then, her voice low and even. "Hunger's no sin, but it's no excuse either, not when a man's already down. We help him up first. There's always time to be hungry after." A woman of the town had come out from under the poulterer's awning to help her, an apple seller by her apron, broad and cheerful, and no better dressed than the carter himself, and the two of them worked together in the mud while the gentlefolk looked on. It was a thing Selwyn marked and did not forget, that of all the people gathered at that corner, the only two who stooped were the poorest, and the poorest of the poor was a girl in a threadbare cloak who had been bred, if the name were true, to a fortune that could buy the whole of the market twice over. He had seen a great deal of charity in his life, most of it performed from a carriage window with an eye to who might be watching. He had not often seen a person kneel. The carter had got himself to a sitting position and was staring at her as though she had dropped out of the sky. Miss, you'll ruin your cloak. You mustn't. It is only mud," she said, "and I am only cold. Both will mend. Your axle, I am afraid, will not, but I dare say the wheelwright by the church will let you owe him until market day. Tell him Miss Haywood sent you, and that I will stand the difference if you cannot." Selwyn, who had stopped where he stood, felt something turn over in him at the name, some faint cold prickle of recognition, and dismissed it at once as impossible. Haywood was not so uncommon a name. And this could not be the shipping heiress, the biddable mouse, the plain silent creature his uncle had bought him for the price of a mortgage. This was some tradesman's daughter or governess, kneeling in the muck of a market with an apple in each reddened hand. He told himself so, and half believed it, and yet he did not walk on. The stout woman in the good bonnet had drifted closer, drawn by the word, and now she peered down at the kneeling girl with an expression Selwyn knew well, the particular pleasure some people take in the low estate of others. Haywood, she repeated. Surely not the Haywoods of Marchfield. The Cole people. She said Cole as another might say plague. My dear, whatever are you doing in the road? Does your father know his daughter grubs about in the mud with the carters? And you to be married to a duke, they say, though I confess I could scarce credit it when I heard. Then perhaps you should not repeat it, the young woman said, without heat, without looking up, gathering the last of the apples. A thing scarce credited is generally left unspoken. Good day to you, madam. Mind the mud. It was so mildly said, and so entirely final, that the stout woman had no answer to it at all, and stood working her mouth for a moment before she gathered her offended dignity and swept away. And Selwyn, standing unseen at the edge of the little scene, felt the corner of his mouth move in a way it had not moved in a long while, not quite a smile, but the ghost of the memory of one. So this was the girl. He looked at her again, and saw her truly for the first time, though she never once looked his way. His uncle had called her plain, and by the reckoning of a ballroom perhaps she was. But his uncle had also called her biddable, and silent, and a mouse, and Selwyn had just watched her stop a thief with a word, shame a gossip without raising her voice, and pledge her own purse to a stranger's broken axle while the respectable folk of the town stepped daintily over his ruin. Whatever else Melina Haywood might be, she was not what he had been sold. She got to her feet, brushing at the mud on her cloak with the resigned air of one who did not expect to succeed, and pressed something into the carter's hand, a coin, Selwyn thought, though she turned so that no one should see it, and told him again to mind the wheelwright by the church. Then she pulled her hood up against the cold and made to go, and for one instant, as she turned, her eyes passed across the tall grave man in the plain dark coat who stood watching her. She did not know him. There was no reason on earth she should. They had never met, and no crest marked him, and his face was nothing to her but one more stranger's face in a crowded market. He might have spoken. Some impulse he did not recognize moved in him to speak, to say some small true thing, to keep her a moment longer in the world of the market, where he was only a man in a plain coat, and she only a girl with mud on her cloak. But the habit of silence held him, as it always held him, and the moment when he might have opened his mouth passed and was gone. But she gave him a small grave nod, as one gives a courteous stranger, and there was in her eyes as they met his a directness, an unhurried honesty, that struck him almost like a blow, for it asked nothing of him. In all the years since his wife had died, Selwyn had grown used to being looked at as a duke, which is to say as a purse, a title, a door to be got through. This girl looked at him as a man, because she believed him to be nothing more, and something long frozen in him ached faintly at the thaw. Then she was gone, swallowed into the grey press of the market, and he stood alone among the scattered straw and the smell of cold apples, and found that his heart was beating as it had not beaten in years. He did not follow her. He told himself there was no purpose in it, that they would meet soon enough at the altar, that a wise man did not let a single mild moment in a marketplace overthrow the settled indifference of years. He told himself that his uncle was right, that the marriage was a transaction and nothing more, that he expected nothing of the girl or the day, and would therefore not be disappointed. He told himself all of this, standing in the ruined market with his pulse unquiet in his throat. But that night, back in the cold quiet of Bramholt, he took the little portrait up again from where it lay face down upon the desk, and he turned it over, and he looked for a long time at the plain grave face the provincial artist had failed to flatter, and he understood, with a slow unwilling certainty that frightened him more than his uncle's threats ever had, that the artist had not failed at all. The man had simply never seen her stop a thief with a word, or kneel in the mud for a stranger, or look a duke in the eye and see only a man. He had painted what was in front of him. He had not known where to look. Selwyn set the portrait upright against the inkwell, where he could see it, and he sat a long while in the failing light and did not ring for a candle. He was a man who had taught himself to want nothing, 'cause wanting had only ever taught him grief, And here, a fortnight from a wedding he had meant to endure like a cold, was the first thing in a dozen years that he was afraid he might come to want. He did not yet know her name was the same as the one upon the mortgage. He did not yet let himself believe it could be. But the pull of it was on him already. That first faint tightening of a line he could not see, and though he could not have said so then, the settled emptiness he had built so carefully about his heart had, that grey afternoon in the market, taken its first small and irreparable crack. The rain came before he reached the crossroads, and Selwyn, Duke of Bramholt, did nothing to hasten his horse against it. He had left Bramholt Court in a plain brown coat, without crest or escort, and he told himself it was only the weather he wished to be lost in. It was not the weather. It was the wedding 6 days hence, and the woman his uncle's arrangement had bound him to, a Miss Melina Haywood of whom he knew 3 facts and cared for none, that her family had once held land and held it no longer, that she was said to be quiet, and that she was to be his wife whether he had ever exchanged a word with her or not. He had signed the settlement without reading past the figures. He had let his uncle believe him indifferent, because he was indifferent, and because indifference was the only armour he had trusted in 11 years. 11 years since Lady Cassandra Vere had smiled at him across a ballroom and let him believe, for one whole season, that she saw the man and not the coronet. He had been 28 and foolish enough to offer her everything. She had taken the offer to the Marquess of Enderby the moment Enderby's fortune proved the larger, and she had done it in a letter, and the letter had been read aloud at a supper party for the amusement of 40 people before it ever reached Selwyn's hand. He had learned 2 lessons that night that he had never since unlearned, that a woman who smiled at a duke was smiling at the dukedom, and that a man who let himself be seen was a man handing others the knife. So he rode plainly, and he rode alone, and he told himself he went to survey the Tennant Road washed out by the spring floods, which was true, and not to look upon the woman he was to marry before the day made looking unavoidable, which was also true, and which he did not admit even to the rain. The road bent past a low stone cottage with a sagging gate, and it was there his horse threw its shoe. He felt the gate break beneath him, swung down, and found the animal favouring its off-fore where the iron had wrenched half away against a hidden stone. He was 3 miles from the nearest smith, and the light was failing and the rain had settled into the steady, patient kind that meant to stay. Selwyn stood in the lane with his ruined boots and his anonymous coat and permitted himself a single, bitter observation on the humour of Providence. "You'll lame him if you lead him on that," a voice said. He turned. A young woman had come out from the cottage gate with a shawl held over her head against the wet, and she was looking not at him but at the horse, at the lifted hoof, with the plain assessing frankness of someone who had handled animals all her life. She was perhaps 24. Her gown was grey and much mended, the hem darned in a shade that did not quite match, and her boots were a countrywoman's boots, cracked at the toe. Rain had darkened the loose hair at her temples. She was not, by the measure of the drawing rooms he endured, a beauty. And yet there was something in the set of her that arrested him, some steadiness, as though the weather and the ruined evening were simply facts to be met and not calamities to be lamented. "I am aware," Selwyn said, more coldly than he meant. Cold was habit. "Then you'll not lead him another step in this lane," she answered, unbothered by his tone, already crossing to the horse. "There's a lean-to at the side, dry straw. My father kept a forge before." She stopped herself, and he saw the smallest hesitation cross her face, and then she went on without finishing the sentence. "There are tools. I can draw the loose iron off him at least, so he doesn't tear the hoof. You'll not get to Ackworth tonight regardless." He should have refused. A duke did not shelter in a stranger's lean-to and let a poor woman handle his horse. But he was not a duke tonight. He was a man in a brown coat, which was precisely the thing he had wanted, and he found he could not now put the coronet back on without confessing the game. And beneath the reasoning, plainer than he liked, was simple curiosity. She had not curtsied. She had not simpered. She had looked at his horse before she looked at him, and she was already at work. "Selwyn," he said, when she glanced up for a name. It was his own, and it told her nothing, and it was the first honest thing he had given a stranger in a very long while. "Melina," she said, and led the horse toward the shelter. He did not start. He was proud afterward that he did not start. But the name went through him like the cold going through the wet wool of his coat, and he stood a moment in the lane with the rain on his face before he followed her under the low roof. "Melina Haywood." There could not be two, not on this road, not with a father who had kept a forge and lost it. The woman he had bound himself to without a word, the quiet nothing his uncle had procured for him, was standing in a leaking lean-to with her sleeves pushed up, running a knowing hand down his horse's leg and murmuring to the animal to be still. She did not know him. That was the whole of it, and it held him rooted. She had no notion that the drenched traveller she had taken in was the Duke of Bramholt, the man whose ring she would wear within the week, the man whose name was spoken in her own cottage, surely with dread or with calculation as such names always were. She thought him a nobody. So, for the length of one rainy evening, he would see exactly what she was when there was no dukedom in the room to smile at. Hold his head, she said. He knows you. He'll fret less. He held the horse's head. She lit a stub of candle in a horn lantern, found a rasp and pincers on a shelf furred with old dust, and set to the loose shoe with a competence that shamed the grooms at Bramholt. She talked while she worked, not to fill the silence, but because the horse settled to a voice, and Selwyn, who was accustomed to being talked at, found himself only listening. My father was smith and farrier both, before the debts, she said, easing the wrenched nails. People think a woman can't have the trade. I had it from him the way other girls had samplers. It's the one thing they couldn't take when they took the rest. No bitterness weighted the words. She stated it as she had stated the rain. A fact to be met. They, Selwyn said. The creditors. My uncle's creditors, truly. He mortgaged the forge and the land both against a scheme that failed, and when he died the notes came due on us. She freed the ruined iron, held it up to the lantern, tossed it aside. My mother and I had the cottage and little else. She is gone 2 winters now. So it is only me. Again, no plea in it. She might have been reciting a neighbour's misfortune. And you are to be married? He said before he had decided to say it. I heard as much on the road. A great match, they said. Her hands stilled on the horse's fetlock. For the first time something guarded came into her face, and it was not the guardedness of a schemer measuring her advantage. It was the look of a person touched on a bruise. A great match, she repeated. Yes, to the Duke of Bramholt. She resumed her work, slower now. You needn't say it the way the village says it, as though I have contrived some triumph. I contrived nothing. My uncle's debts were bought up quietly by the Bramholt estate, and I was informed that the balance would be forgiven upon the marriage. It was arranged over my head between men who never asked me a single question. I met the arrangement, not the man. I have never so much as seen his face. She glanced up and her mouth turned in something that was not quite a smile. They tell me he is proud and cold and does not want the wedding either, so we are agreed on that much, he and I, though we have never spoken. Selwyn stood very still in the reeking, honest dark of the lean-to and felt the ground of 11 years shift very slightly beneath him. That is a hard thing, he said, to be sold to settle another man's account. It is not the marriage I'd have chosen, she said simply, but I'll not pity myself in front of a stranger, and I'll not go into his house sulking either. If I am to be his wife, I will be an honest one. I will keep his people well and his horses sound, and I will never once pretend to them if I do not. That much I can give him, truth at least. It costs nothing and I've little else to bring. She patted the horse's neck. There, he'll stand the night on that. In the morning walk him slow to Ackworth, and the smith will set him proper. Truth at least. It costs nothing. He thought of Cassandra Vere, whose every word had been costed to the shilling, and he could not for a moment reconcile the 2 women standing in the same phrase. And he thought, unbidden, of Rosanna Norcott, who would be seated near the front of the cathedral in ivory silk on the day, having made it plain across 3 seasons that she considered the Duke of Bramholt hers by rights of blood and beauty, and had never forgiven the arrangement that passed her over. He knew precisely how Rosanna spoke of women like the one before him now. He had her do it, her voice like the ring of fine glass, dressing contempt in wit so that cruelty might pass at a supper table for cleverness, and no one need own to it. Rosanna would look at a mended grey gown and a farrier's daughter and see only sport. And here was the farrier's daughter, who owned nothing Rosanna owned, giving away her own supper to a stranger in the dark and calling it no more than what the rain required. You do not ask, he said slowly, whether I might carry word to the Duke on your behalf. A tenant in from the road. You do not ask me to speak well of you to him. She looked at him then with plain surprise. Why would I? I don't know that you'll ever cross his path, and I'd not have a good word bought the way regardless. If the Duke thinks well of me, let it be for something I've done, not something a stranger told him in a stable. She wiped her hands on her apron. Besides, you've the look of a man with troubles of his own. I'll not add mine to your load. He almost laughed. It broke out of him half against his will, low and startled, and she smiled at the sound as if she'd earned it. And the smile changed her whole plain face into something he could not afterward describe and could not stop attempting to. She would not hear of him riding on in the dark. There was bread, she said, and cheese, and a fire that smoked but gave heat, and it was no more than she'd do for any soul the rain caught out. She fed him at a scrubbed deal table in a room that held nearly nothing, and what it held was clean, and she asked him nothing of his business as though prying were a kind of theft. He watched her ladle broth she plainly meant to have been her own supper into a bowl she set before him, and take the smaller share for herself without remark, and he understood that she did not know she was doing anything worth notice. That was the thing that undid him, sitting there in his brown coat. She was not being kind at him. She was simply kind in an empty cottage to a nobody who could do nothing for her, with no audience and no advantage and no Duke to see. "Why do you look at me so?" she asked at last, not sharply, breaking a bit of bread. "Because I am the man you are to marry, and you have shown me in 1 hour more of yourself than 11 years of ballrooms ever showed me of anyone. Because you spoke my name to my face and did not flatter it. Because I came here to be certain I felt nothing, and I have failed entirely. You remind me of no one," he said, which was the truest answer he had, "and I have met a great many people." She considered that as though it were a riddle worth solving and let it go, and offered him more bread. He asked her, because he could not help it, what she hoped for from the great house, expecting the answer every woman of his acquaintance would have given: carriages, jewels, a place above those who had scorned her. She only frowned a little, as though the question were oddly shaped. "Hope for?" she said. "I've learned not to hope loudly. It draws the notice of whatever it is that likes to take things away." She turned her spoon slowly. "But if you press me, I should like a house where the servants are not afraid, and animals kept kindly, and one room with a window facing east, so I might have the morning in it. And I should like, some day, to be looked at by the man across the table as though he were glad I was there and not merely resigned to it." She caught herself and gave a short, rueful breath of a laugh. "That last is beyond arranging, I think. One cannot mortgage a man's regard the way one mortgages a forge. Is given freely or it is not given at all. I shall do without it, if I must, and be content with the window." Selwyn looked down at the bowl she had filled from her own portion, and could not for a moment trust his voice. He had 100 windows facing east. He had never once thought to stand at any of them and be glad of anyone. He wondered, with a vertiginous lurch he disguised by reaching for the bread, what manner of man he had been, that a woman with nothing had learned to ask for less than the smallest thing he owned in abundance, and that he had never known he was withholding it. He slept in the lean-to among the clean straw with his horse's breath warm beside him, and he did not sleep much. He lay looking at the seams of grey between the boards and turned the evening over and over like a coin he could not spend. In 6 days a cathedral full of the great, and the vicious would watch the Duke of Bramholt marry a pauper's daughter, and they would pity him or mock her or both, and Rosanna Norcott would be among them with her clever mouth and her lovely ruthless friends, sharpening their small knives. He had expected to endure the day the way he endured every day, armoured, absent, giving nothing. He had expected the bride to be a stranger he would spend a lifetime not knowing. He had not expected her to have already fed him from her own bowl. Before first light he rose. He left coin on the table, and then thought better of it, and took the coin back, because coin was the coronet by another name, and she would know the giver had thought her poor. Instead he split and stacked the sodden wood by her door where it might dry quietly, so as not to wake her, the way a man might who had nothing to give but the work of his hands. Then he saddled the walking lame horse and led it out into the thin grey morning. She came to the gate before he reached the lane, a shawl over her shift hair loose. "You've a long walk," she said. "God keep you on it, Selwyn." "And you," he said. He paused, with the reins in his hand and the wet road before him, and the whole architecture of his careful life waiting at the end of it. "Melina, whatever manner of man your Duke proves, do not let him make you less than you were tonight. I think you'd be wasted, learning to be small in a great house." Something moved behind her eyes that he could not read. I don't intend to be small, she said. I only intend to be honest. We shall see if the great house can bear it. He mounted and rode, and did not look back until the bend of the lane forced the cottage out of sight, and then he looked back the whole length of it, at the sagging gate and the woodpile drying by the door, and the grey figure still standing there watching him go. He turned his face to Ackworth and to Bramholt beyond it, to his uncle and the settlements and the cathedral 6 days off. And he found that the indifference he had worn for 11 years like a second skin had come loose in a single rainy night, and would not be pulled straight again however he tried. He rode toward his own wedding a changed and secret man, knowing what his bride did not, that they had already met. And that the woman the whole county was preparing to pity had, without a word of flattery or a glance at his rank, quietly become the one thing in the world he could not look away from. He came back to Bramholt Court after dark, gave the lamed horse to a startled groom without a word of where it had gone wrong, and climbed to his rooms with the reins still standing in his hair. He did not ring for a fire. He sat a long while in the cold with his boots ruined past saving and a slice of coarse bread in his coat pocket that he had not eaten and could not bring himself to throw away, and he thought of a sagging gate and a grey figure watching a stranger ride off into the wet. In 11 years he had trained himself to want nothing that could be taken from him. He recognized, sitting there, the precise sensation of that training coming undone, and he found he had no more power to stop it than a man has to stop the tide by frowning at it. His uncle noticed the change within a day, though he mistook its cause entirely. "You are restless," Lord Auberon Vane observed over the breakfast table, watching his nephew leave a plate untouched for the second morning. "It becomes you no better than the sulking did. The blessing is Thursday. You will stand up in the cathedral before the whole county and let the bishop read the banns a third and final time, and you will look at least as though you consent to your own good fortune, or the gossips will have you jilting the girl at the very altar." "I have never yet failed to appear where I was told to appear," Selwyn said. "You need not fear my absence, uncle, only my silence, which you have long survived." In truth, the restlessness had teeth. He had passed the intervening days walking the long galleries of Bramholt in the small hours, past the portraits of dukes who had married for land and lived out their lives as strangers to their duchesses, and he had found himself pausing before the one painting he generally passed with his eyes averted, the young duchess dead these dozen years, her painted hand resting where a swelling had killed her, and the sun with her before the frost was off the ground. He had loved her quietly and buried her quietly, and told himself afterward that the world was not to be trusted with such quietness twice. That doctrine had served him faithfully. It had made him feared and solitary and safe. He stood before her portrait on the Tuesday and could not, for the life of him, recall why safety had ever seemed worth the whole of a life, and he was frightened by his failure to recall it. And he went down the next morning and left his plate untouched, and his uncle named it restlessness and understood nothing at all. He did not tell Auberon that he had already looked upon his bride. He did not tell him of the cottage, or the bread, or the name he had given at the gate, his own Christian name and nothing more, offered to a woman who had taken him for a wanderer and treated him better than the ton had treated him in a decade. He hoarded the knowledge as a miser hoards a coin he dares not spend. She did not know him. That was the whole of his advantage and the whole of his cowardice, and he was ashamed of how tightly he held to it, and he held to it all the same. Thursday came grey and still. The cathedral at Ackworth stood black with age above the market square, and by 11 the county had poured itself into the nave in silk and feathers to witness the great alliance. The ancient dukedom of Bramholt joined at last to the Haywood money that had bought up its debts. Selwyn came in by the north door and took his place apart, in the shadow of a pillar near the chancel steps, and let the crowd flow and murmur below him without troubling to descend into it. It was an old habit and a useful one. From the height of his reserve he could watch a whole room and give it nothing, and the room, unable to read him, filled the silence with its own inventions. Let them. He had learned long ago that a man who is seen is a man handing others the knife, and he had no intention of being seen today by anyone at all. Then the west door opened and she came in, and he forgot the pillar and the crowd and the careful arithmetic of his own face. She wore grey. Amid all that plumage she wore a plain grey gown gone soft at the cuffs with washing, and a bonnet that had been good perhaps 4 seasons past, and she carried herself up the long aisle, as though the shabbiness were a thing of no account whatever, which he saw at once was the very quality that made the county unable to forgive her. A poor woman who cringed they could have pitied and enjoyed. Melina Haywood did not cringe. She walked into a church full of people prepared to despise her with her chin level and her step unhurried, and she looked about the great vaulted place with a plain, honest wonder as one who had never stood beneath such a roof and did not mean to pretend otherwise. Selwyn's breath went from him. He had known she would be here. He had not known that the sight of her walking toward him under 1,000 hostile eyes would strike him like a hand laid flat against the chest. He drew back further into the shadow of the pillar. He was not ready. He needed a moment more before she should look up and find her betrothed, and he took it, and in taking it he watched the county close upon her like water over a stone. It began, as such things always began, with kindness worn as a mask. A young woman detached herself from a knot of silk near the front pews and came down the aisle to meet Melina with both hands extended and a smile of dazzling warmth. Selwyn knew her. Miss Rosanna Norcott was the beauty of the district, the only child of a family as old as his own and a great deal solventer, and she had spent 3 seasons and no little art arranging to be considered the natural and inevitable Duchess of Bramholt. That the coronet had gone instead to a moneylender's plain daughter she had received as a personal wound, and she had come to the cathedral, Selwyn understood in an instant, not to witness the alliance but to avenge it. Miss Haywood, Rosanna cried, loud enough for the near pews. But how brave of you! I said to Mamma only this morning, she will never dare come in her well, and here you are, and in the very same gown you wore to the assembly, which shows a thrift I am sure his grace will come to treasure. One does hear such economical habits are the making of a great house. 2 of her companions, flanking her like handmaids, pressed their gloves to their lips. It is the same gown, Melina agreed. I have but the one that is fit for a church. I should think a house that cannot bear the sight of it twice has troubles a 3rd gown would not mend. A small silence opened. Rosanna's smile did not falter, she was too well schooled for that, but it hardened at the corners. How quaint you are, she said. How very plain-spoken. It must be the trade in you. My father says one always knows the shopkeeper's blood, however it is scrubbed and dressed and married upward. I only hope, my dear, that when you stand at that altar you will remember it is a duke you are having, and not a customer to be haggled with. Though I dare say you were bought cheaply enough yourself, so perhaps you know the way of a bargain better than any of us. The companions tittered. Along the near pews 12 fans lifted to hide the same delighted cruelty. Selwyn, in the shadow of the pillar, felt something he had believed long dead turn over in him, slow and cold and dangerous. He watched Melina take the blow. He watched her understand precisely what had been done to her, and precisely how many people were waiting to feed on her answer, and he saw her decline to give them the meal. You are quite right that I was bought, she said, and her voice was low and steady and carried further for being quiet, so that the tittering died to hear it. My father holds the notes, and the notes will be forgiven, and a great old name will keep its roof. I have never pretended otherwise, Miss Norcott, and I find I am not ashamed of it. A woman who is honest about her price is a poorer sort of prize, I know, than a woman who is bought for as much and calls it love, but I would rather be the first than the second. It costs less in the end. She let that sit a moment in the ringing quiet. I hope you will be very welcome at the wedding. It was not shouted, it was not even unkind. It was merely true, and it fell into the center of Rosanna Norcott's polished malice, and turned every eye that had come to laugh at the shopkeeper's daughter toward the beauty who had gone the color of ash. Selwyn had sat through 1,000 exchanges in 1,000 drawing rooms and watched the well-born flay one another with smiling knives, and he had never in his life seen a blade turned so cleanly by so plain a hand. And then a gentleman near the pews, a young buck of Rosanna's set, emboldened by her lead, said not quite under his breath but meaning to be heard, the impudence of the creature, someone ought to teach the girl her place before she disgraces the cathedral. Selwyn was moving before he had decided to move. He came down out of the shadow of the chancel steps, and the change in the nave was immediate and total, for the county had not marked him standing there and now marked nothing else. The Duke of Bramholt walked into the aisle with his cold, unhurried step and his unreadable face, and the tittering stopped as though a hand had closed over it, and Rosanna Norcott sank into a curtsy the depth of which was itself a confession. He did not look at her. He came to a hot and easy distance from Melina, and he turned his level grey gaze upon the young buck who had spoken, and he let the silence stretch until the man's flush had climbed to the roots of his hair. Her place, Selwyn said very quietly, is beside me. She will be Duchess of Bramholt within the week, and every soul in this church will one day account it the greatest honour of a small life to have been received by her. You have my leave to begin practising the curtsy now. He let his eyes travel, once, without haste, over the fans and the smiles and the whole silked assembly that had gathered to feast on a woman in a four-season gown. It is a long way, he added, from the cathedral door to the chancel. I should be sorry to think any guest of mine could not walk it without stumbling into cruelty. Those who find they cannot may leave before the bishop comes. I will hold no grudge against an empty pew. For a moment nothing in the great nave moved at all. Rosanna Norcott held her curtsy a beat too long, as though the flagstones might open and spare her the rising again. The young buck stood scarlet and speechless with his ruin complete, and along the pews the fans came down one by one, folded, and lay still in gloved laps. The county had come to Ackworth certain of a single, simple truth, that the Duke of Bramholt regarded his purchased bride with the same weary indifference he was known to turn upon all the world, and that they were therefore free to despise her as they pleased. In 30 words he had taken the certainty from them and left them nothing to stand on, and Selwyn could see the calculation running behind 100 smooth faces, the swift and cowardly revision by which a woman marked that mourning for the season's sport became, between one breath and the next. A person it might be dangerous to have offended. No one left, no one dared. Selwyn had spoken perhaps 30 words and undone in the speaking every advantage of position and blood the room had thought it held over the woman in grey, and he had done it, he realised with a distant astonishment. Without calculation, without weighing the cost, moved by nothing more governable than the sight of her standing alone and unbowed. He who weighed everything. He turned at last, because he'd no longer keep from it, and he looked full at Melina Haywood, and Melina Haywood looked back at him, and he watched something cross her face that stopped his heart within him. She had gone still. Not with fear. She had borne Rosanna without a tremor, but with a strange, arrested attention, her brows drawn faintly together, her honest eyes moving over his face as though searching it for a word she had mislaid. He knew that look. He had felt its twin turn in his own breast at a cottage gate 3 nights gone. She was not seeing the Duke of Bramholt. She was seeing something underneath the Duke, something the coronet and the cold face could not quite cover. And for one endless instant Selwyn stood on the edge of the whole thing coming down, the wet lane, the bread, the name he had given her, and he did the only thing his long-schooled reserve knew how to do. He drew his face closed like a door. He made it colder. He let no warmth into his eyes at all, though it cost him more than the room could have guessed, and he saw the search in her expression falter and go uncertain, and he told himself the relief he felt was relief and not grief, and did not believe himself for a moment. Your Grace is very good, Melina said slowly, to trouble himself over so small a matter as my dignity. It was not a small matter. He heard his own voice come out clipped and level, the voice he used to keep the world at its distance, and he hated it and could not stop it. Cruelty in a house of God offends me. It was nothing to do with you. He saw that land, saw her take the coldness and read it correctly as a wall and not a wound, and decline, as she declined everything, to flatter her way past it. A lesser woman would have wept her gratitude, or fluttered, or seized the moment to make herself agreeable to the man whose ring she was days from wearing. Melina did none of it. She inclined her head with a grave courtesy that gave him exactly what he was owed and not 1 grain more. Then I shall thank you for the offence and not for myself, she said, since you would rather I did. It is a poor sort of thanks, but it is honest, and I have found honest things generally wear the longest. A verger was murmuring at the far door. The bishop was coming. The county was rustling itself into its pews. She glanced toward the sound and then back to him, and the trouble had come into her face again, quieter now, worrying at her. Forgive me. I feel I am being very foolish, and yet I cannot shake it. Have we met before, your Grace? Somewhere I would not have looked to find a duke. The knave, the bishop, the 11 guarded years, everything in Selwyn narrowed to that one soft question, and the ruin that a single honest word would make of him. He looked at her upturned face, at the grey gown and the level chin and the eyes that had searched him out beneath all his armour, and he understood that he wanted, with a violence that frightened him, to say yes, yes, at a broken gate in the rain. Yes, you gave me bread and did not know me and were kinder to the nothing than the world has ever been to the Duke. He wanted to tell her, and he heard himself instead say, I think you would remember it if you had. Men in my position are not easily overlooked, Miss Haywood. No, she said, still studying him, unconvinced and too courteous to press it. No, I don't suppose you are. But she did not look away, and neither, God help him, did he, and for a moment there in the aisle with the whole watching county pretending not to watch. The Duke of Bramholt stood caught in the plain grey gaze of the woman he was cheating of the truth, and found he would have given a very great deal to go on standing there, to keep her talking, to keep those eyes upon him, to hear one more honest sentence in a voice that flattered nothing and no one, and found worse, that the wanting did not shame him at all. The bishop's procession came up the aisle then, and duty pulled them apart, she to her place among the meagre Haywood party, he to the cold ducal pew beneath the pillar, and he watched her go with the taste of the lie still in his mouth, and something perilously like happiness fighting it there for room. He had come to Ackworth meaning to be seen by no one. He rode home that afternoon having been seen, and having seen, and knowing with a clarity that unsettled the very foundations of the life he had so carefully walled, that in 6 days he would marry a woman who did not know his true face, and that he was no longer certain he could bear to keep it from her, nor how in the world he would ever now consent to give her up. 3 days before the wedding, Selwyn left Bramholt Court by the stable gate in the brown coat again, and told his valet nothing, and rode out through the dusk toward the grey house at the edge of Ackworth where his uncle had installed the bride to be dressed and drilled and made ready for the great day. He had no honest business there. He told himself he went to be certain she had come to no fresh harm after the fitting, which was a thing he had no right to know of and could not have explained knowing, and he did not examine the lie past its usefulness. He had heard, through a footman who did not know he carried tales to the Duke himself, how the morning had gone, how the ladies who had come to look on the pauper bride under the pretence of kindness had made a sport of her mended things. How Rosanna Norcott had held up a length of ivory silk against the grey mended gown Melina wore and said, in a voice like the ring of fine glass, that some cloth simply would not take dye above its station, and how the room had laughed behind its fans. He had not been in the room. He had learned it second-hand, and it had sat in his chest all day like a swallowed coal, and now here he was at dusk on a lame excuse, riding to a house he was forbidden by every rule of his own game to enter. He did not go to the door. He tied the horse in the lane beyond the wall, and went along the old orchard where the apple trees leaned against the grey stone, and he found the side gate off its latch, and he let himself into the walled garden the way a poacher lets himself onto another man's land. The light was nearly gone. Bats cut the last of it above the espaliered piers, and there, at the far end where a bench stood against the wall, he found her alone, sitting very straight with her hands folded in her lap and her face turned up to the first stars, as though she were counting them or asking them something. And he stopped in the shadow of a tree and simply looked, and did not announce himself, and felt the swallowed coal in his chest turn over into something worse and sweeter that he had no armour for at all. She heard him before he moved. She had a countrywoman's ears. "Who is there?" she said, not frightened, rising, and then the starlight caught the plain brown of his coat, and her whole guarded body eased in a way that undid him further. Selwyn, his name in her mouth, warm and astonished and glad. "You? How in the world, what are you doing here?" "I was on the road again," he said, which was very nearly nothing, and came out of the tree's shadow. "I heard the Haywood girl had been brought to this house to be married out of it. I thought I would see whether she still handled her troubles as she handled my horse." It was as near to the truth as he could carry to her, and it made her laugh, low, and press her fingers to her mouth as if the laugh were a luxury she must ration. "You should not be here," she said. "If they find a strange man in the garden 3 nights before the Duke's wedding, it is not you they will ruin. It is me. I should send you off over that wall this instant." She did not move to send him off. She sat again slowly, and after a moment she made room on the bench with a small motion of her hand, and Selwyn, Duke of Bramholt, who had refused thrones of chairs in the finest rooms in the kingdom, sat down on a cold stone bench beside a farrier's daughter, as though it were the only seat he had ever wanted. "They dressed you today," he said. "They tried." She looked at her folded hands. "There is a great deal of ceremony to it. Women I have never met, deciding what I am to be poured into, and clucking over my hands. They are rough, you know, from the trade, and my hair, and my walk. I did not know a person could walk wrongly until this morning. I have been walking my whole life and thought I had the way of it." She said it lightly, but he heard underneath the thing she would not say, and he found he could not let her carry it alone under the pretense that it weighed nothing. "I heard how they used you," he said. "The silk. What was said over it?" Her chin came up. "Then you heard more than I'd have chosen to tell you." A silence, a bat stitched across the stars. "There was a lady," she said at last quietly, "very beautiful, in a gown the colour of cream, who held the cloth to me and told the room I could not be improved above my station, that some things will not take the dye." And they laughed. And I stood there in my mother's mended grey with the cloth against my face, and I thought. She stopped and steadied herself and went on. "I thought, I will not weep in front of you, madam, whatever else you take from me today." So I thanked her for her opinion of the dye, and I said that in my father's trade we learned that the plainest iron, well used, outlasts the prettiest that is only kept for show, and that I hoped I might prove as serviceable. And she stopped laughing. And I was glad of that, God forgive me, for about the space of a breath, and then I was only tired. Selwyn sat with his jaw tight in the dark. He had faced men across dueling grounds with less murder in him than he felt now toward a woman in cream silk, who would be seated near the front of his cathedral in 3 days' time. "You bettered her," he said, plainly. "She will not have forgotten it." "That is the trouble with bettering people like her," Melina said. "They do not forget it, and they do not forgive it, and they have a great deal more time and money to spend on remembering than I have to spend on defending myself. I did not win anything this morning, Selwyn. I only made an enemy sharper. A wiser woman would have wept and been pitied. I have never learned to be pitied. It is a skill, I think, like walking correctly, and I have got that wrong too." He looked at her profile against the pale wall, at the tiredness she would not dress up as anything nobler than it was, and he understood that this was the thing no drawing room had ever shown him. Cassandra Vere had wept beautifully on cue for effect. Every tear had been a coin laid down against a return. This woman would rather have died than be seen to weep, and had no notion that the refusal was a kind of grandeur that all Rosanna Norcott's silk could not counterfeit. He had come armoured in 11 years of not being moved, and he sat there being moved past any hope of hiding it, and was grateful for the dark. "Tell me the rest," he said, "not the wedding. Before all this, you told me of the forge and the debts. Tell me what you have not told me." She glanced at him, surprised, as though no one had asked her a question expecting the answer to be worth the hearing. "Why should you want to know?" "Because," he said, and could not finish it honestly, and gave her the part he could. "Because I have listened to a great many people describe themselves, and none of them told the truth, and I find I would rather hear one hard true thing tonight than another year of the other kind." So she told him. She told him of her mother, who had taught her to read from the one book they kept when the rest were sold, and who had died in the second winter of the cold with Melina holding her hands, which by then were as rough as Melina's own. She told him of the forge going quiet, the great bellows folded like a dead thing, the neighbours who had been glad enough of her father's iron and slower to be glad of his orphan. She told him of learning to shoe the parish's horses herself at 15, in a leather apron 3 sizes too large, because the money would not come from anywhere else and pride was a thing she could not afford to keep along with the cottage. She told it all without once turning it to gain her his pity, laying each hard year down flat between them like a horseshoe cooling, a fact and then the next fact, and when she had finished she said, "There, now you know I am not brave. I only did the next thing because there was no one else to do it, and people mistake that for courage because it is quieter than fear and easier to praise. That is the only kind of courage there is," Selwyn said, and meant it so entirely that his voice was not quite steady. "The rest is only men who have never been truly afraid, telling stories afterward. I have known a great many brave men. Not one of them ever shod a horse at 15 because the alternative was hunger. You speak of brave men as though you had reason to be weary of them, she said. I have reason to be weary of a great many fine things, he answered, that proved, on handling, to be only kept for show. He had not meant to give her even that much of himself, and he saw her mark it, and store it away, and choose not to pry which was its own kindness. The second she had shown him without knowing, and she heard the unsteadiness still in him, and turned to look at him. They were closer on the bench than he had known. The last light had gone, only the stars now, and the pale wall, and the grey of her face turned up to his. He could see the loose hair at her temple, the same as on the rainy night, and without deciding to, he lifted his hand and tucked it back behind her ear, the smallest motion, his fingers brushing the cool line of her cheek, and she did not draw away. She went very still, the way the horse had gone still under her hand, and her eyes searched his in the dark, and for a long moment there was nothing in the garden but the two of them and the thing between them that neither had spoken and both now plainly knew. Selwyn, she said very low, and it was not glad now, it was frightened, and the fear was for him and not of him. This is a folly. Do you understand what I am? I am to be married in this church in 3 days to a man I have never seen, and my whole life and the forgiveness of a dead man's debts hang upon my walking into it unspoilt and unspoken for. And you are a stranger who comes to me out of the rain and out of the dark and sits too near me on a bench, and I let you, which is worse. If I had any sense I would hate you for coming here. I would hate you for making me feel. She stopped. Feel what? He said. He should not have asked it. He asked it. Sorry, she whispered. For a life I have not begun. That is a cruel thing to do to a woman 3 days before her wedding, to sit beside her and be kind and easy and glad she is there, and let her see what it might have been to be looked at so. And then to climb back over the wall and leave her to marry a cold, proud man who has never troubled to learn the colour of her eyes. Her voice broke on the last of it, only slightly, and she mastered it at once, furious with herself. There. I have wept after all. Not for the silk. For this. You should not have made me. He had never in his life wanted so badly to say a single true thing and could not. The confession stood in his throat, whole and ruinous. It is me. The cold, proud man is me, and I know the colour of your eyes. I learned it the first hour. They are the grey of the sky just before the rain turns to light, and I have not stopped seeing them since. He could put out his hand and end her fear in a breath, and turn her whole broken evening into joy. And he could not, because he had begun the thing in a coward's disguise, and did not yet know how to hand her the truth without it landing as another cruelty dressed as cleverness. Another great one making sport of her under the guise of kindness, the very thing Rosanna had done that morning with the silk. She would think he had toyed with her. She would be right too. So he sat with the truth strangling him and gave her, instead, the only honest thing he could afford. Then let me tell you one thing, he said, and took her hand, the rough, capable, unlovely hand that had shod the parish's horses and closed her mother's eyes, and held it in both of his, and did not raise it to his lips, though he wanted to. Because a kiss was a claim, and he had not yet earned the right to claim anything. He only held it warm between his palms, as a man holds a thing he means never to let be broken. Whatever passes in that cathedral, whatever manner of man the Duke of Bramholt proves. Do not believe that no one saw you. I saw you. Out of the rain and out of the dark, a stranger with no reason to lie to you, I saw exactly what you are, and it is worth more than every yard of silk in that house. And the man who does not spend the rest of his life glad you are at his table is a fool past all mending. Hold to that. On the day, whatever they do to you, hold to that. She was crying now without pretending not to, silently, the tears bright in the starlight, and she did not take her hand from his. You speak, she said, unsteady, as though you knew him, as though you were sure of him. I am sure of nothing in this world, Selwyn said, but that. For a moment he thought she would ask him more, and press it, and he did not know what he would have done if she had. The truth was so near the surface now that a single further question might have brought it up whole. But before she could speak there came, from the dark house across the garden, the small hard sound of a door, and a wedge of candlelight fell out across the grass, and a servant's voice called her name into the night, Miss Hayward. Miss Hayward, are you out here? And a lantern began to bob down the path toward the orchard. Melina was on her feet at once, her hand torn from his, her whole body gone rigid with the old animal knowledge of a poor woman, that discovery is never shared out evenly, that the man goes over the wall and the woman is left to answer for the empty place beside her. Go, she breathed. For the love of God, go, they will ruin me if they find you, go. And then, catching him by the sleeve for one last instant, low and fierce and frightened all at once. Will I see you again? Before tell me true, will I ever see you again? You will see me on the day, Selwyn said before he had weighed it, and knew even as he said it that it was the truest and most dangerous thing he had spoken all night, and saw her not understand it, saw her take it for a kind refusal, a gentle nothing meant to send her away comforted. There was no time to mend it. The lantern was close. He pressed her hand once more hard and let it go, and went back down the orchard the way he had come, over the wall into the black lane, his heart slamming like a smith's hammer. While behind him the servant's light found her standing alone by the bench with her face wet and her chin up, saying in a voice he could just hear that she had only come out for the air, that it was a warm night, that she had wanted a moment before the great day, and no, there was no one. Why should there be anyone? Who would there be? He stood in the lane with his back against the cold stone and his eyes shut, and listened to her lie to protect the both of them, and he understood two things with a terrible clarity. That he loved her, plainly and past retreat, in a way that 11 years of careful nothing had left him wholly unfit to survive, and that his own cowardice had built a trap around her that was drawing tight, a bride seen weeping in a garden, a strange man over the wall, a wounded enemy in cream silk with time and money to spend on remembering, and a wedding rushing down upon all of it in 3 short days. Somewhere in that house a door had opened, and a candle had been lit, and someone now knew that the Duke of Bramholt's unspoilt bride had not been alone in the dark. He mounted the lame horse in the black lane and turned it toward Bramholt. And for the first time since Cassandra Vere had taught him to give the world nothing, Selwyn, Duke of Bramholt, rode home afraid not for himself, whom the world could no longer touch, but for the one person in it he had left standing in the light, alone, holding his secret and her own, with the storm 3 days off and already gathering. The blow he had lain awake all night to meet did not come in the dark, where he had steeled himself for it, but at noon of the following day, in the full flat light of the long gallery, and it came by way of his uncle, which was the one road against which Selwyn had no defence at all. He had spent the morning riding the home farm in the rain to keep from thinking, and he had come in wet and no calmer. And Lord Auberon Vane was waiting for him at the head of the gallery with a folded paper in his hand and a face, had seen perhaps twice in his life the face his uncle wore not when the family was crossed, but when it was threatened. Sit down, Auberon said. I have been in the saddle 4 hours, uncle. I would rather stand. Then stand, and hear me, and understand that I have spent the whole of the morning killing a thing that will not stay dead. He held out the paper, and did not let go of it when Selwyn took the corner, so that for a moment they held it between them like 2 men over a card. There is a story going about Ackworth. It began as all such stories begin, below stairs, and it did not stay there. A maid at the grey house, the one your uncle pays to dress your bride and keep her, carried a lantern into the orchard 2 nights past to fetch the girl in, and found her standing alone at the far wall with her face wet and her story ready, and found also, or says she found, the print of a man's boot in the wet bed beneath the wall, and the side gate off its latch, and a horse gone from the lane where no horse had business being. From that, nephew, the county has built the rest, that the Duke of Bramholt's unspoilt bride is not unspoilt, that she kept a lover in the dark 3 nights before her wedding, that the moneylender sold you soiled goods and thought a coronet would launder them. He let go of the paper. It is at Rosanna Norcott's breakfast table this morning. By this evening it will be at 40. Selwyn stood very still and was grateful, in the cold precise way of a man who has trained himself, for the years that let him stand so. His heart was going like a hammer and his face gave nothing, and behind the nothing he saw it all at once, an entire the lantern, the wet bed, the print of his own boot, the trap he himself had trodden into the soft ground and left there for her to be caught in. He had done this. Not Rosanna, not the maid, not the county with its long teeth. He had climbed the wall and sat too near her and taken her hand between his and left, over the same wall, the whole shape of her ruin pressed into the earth. And what, he said, and heard his own voice come level and far away, do you propose to do, uncle, with a maid's tale on the print of a boot? I propose to save this family, Auberon said, which is the only thing I have ever proposed. Listen to me, Selwyn. The contract is not yet signed at the altar. The banns are read but the vows are not made. If the girl is what they now say she is, you are not bound to her by so much as a hair, and no court, and no bishop in England would hold you to a bargain got by fraud. Haywood cannot compel you. The debts he holds against the estate are heavy, God knows, but they are debts, not chains, and a duke who casts off a wanton 3 days before he weds her will be pitied by the whole county and blamed by none of it. I have already sent word to my man of business to look into how the notes might be met another way. Give me 2 days and I will have you free of her, and free clean, with the county on your side and the girl gone quietly back to her forge where she belongs, and no more said. And her? Selwyn said. When you have me free clean, what becomes of her? His uncle looked at him as though the question were in a language he did not keep. What becomes of her is that she goes home, he said. Which is a great deal better than she deserves, if the tale is true, and no worse than she had a right to expect if it is false. She is a farrier's daughter, Selwyn. She was bought to pay a debt. She has cost you 3 weeks of your time and a morning's gossip, and now she costs you nothing at all. I confess I do not see the difficulty. The difficulty stood in Selwyn's throat, whole and ruinous. The same 2 words that had stood there in the dark garden with her hand between his palms. It was me. Say it, and the tale collapsed. The boot was his, the horse was his, the man over the wall was no lover but the very bridegroom, come like a fool in a brown coat to sit an hour beside a woman who did not know him. Say it, and she was cleared before the county in a breath. But he saw, even as the words rose, the shape what saying them would make saw it land on his uncle's understanding, and go on from there to the world, that the Duke of Bramholt had gone masked and lying to his own bride. That he had let her weep to a stranger, and take a stranger's comfort, and never once told her whose comfort it was. It would clear her of the lover and convict her of a worse thing in the county's arithmetic of being made a fool of by the man she was to marry, of being the plain girl the great lord had played with in the dark for his own amusement. The very sport Rosanna had made of her with the silk, only crueller, because it was her betrothed who had made it. He would save her honor and destroy the one thing she had kept whole through all of it, which was that no one had ever yet made a fool of her. He could not hand her that in his uncle's gallery, second-hand, over a folded paper. Not, sir. You will do nothing, Selwyn said. You will send no word to your man of business. You will unsend what you have sent. The wedding will go forward. Auberon stared at him. Have you heard a word? Aye, every word. The wedding will go forward, uncle. And if I hear that one syllable of this tale has left this house by any door you command, I will know where to lay it, and you will find that the temper you have spent 30 years congratulating yourself on never having seen is not so far off as you supposed. He gave the paper back, folded, unhurried. I am obliged to you for the trouble. I am not obliged to you for the remedy. Leave the girl to me. He went from the gallery before his uncle could gather breath to answer, and got as far as the stair before the trembling took his hand. And he stood a moment gripping the cold rail and mastering it, because there was one more thing to be done before he slept, and it could not be done by a man whose hands shook. He found Rosanna Norcott that afternoon at the assembly rooms, where she had contrived, as she contrived all things, to be exactly where the county could watch her be gracious, and he had her fetched to the small card room apart, and shut the door, and did not sit. She came in triumphant and hid it beautifully under a face of concern, and dropped him a curtsy of just the right depth, and he thought, watching her, that Cassandra Vere had had precisely that gift, the gift of arranging grief and joy alike upon a lovely face like flowers in a ball. For the pleasure and use of whoever was looking, he had married himself once, in his own young heart, to a face like that, and it had cost him 11 years to learn what the face was for. He would not spend a 12th learning it again. Your Grace wished to see me, Rosanna said. I hope there is nothing wrong. One hears such distressing things of late, and on the very eve of your happiness I have been quite unable to credit them. You have been unable to stop repeating them, Selwyn said, which is a different disability, and one I mean to cure this afternoon. There is a tale abroad about my bride. You will tell me plainly what it will cost to have it die. Something flickered behind the concerned surprise that he had come at it so straight, and then a slow satisfaction, for she had waited 3 seasons to be worth the trouble of a private word with the Duke of Bramholt, and here she was worth it at last. Your Grace mistakes me, she said. I have no tale. I have only a great and sisterly anxiety for a young woman thrust so far above her nature. If she has been careless, if there is truth in what the servants say, surely it is a kindness to see her safely return to her own sphere, before she is shamed past mending in a place as public as a cathedral. I want nothing, your grace, only your good and hers. She let her lashes fall. Though I confess I have wondered whether a man of your discernment can truly have looked at that grey little creature and seen a duchess. I should not have thought it of you. I have always believed your grace saw further than other men. It seemed a pity to watch you see so short. There it was, laid on the card table between them, without a coin ever changing hands, not money which she had, but the throne she had built her 3 seasons to sit in. Break the girl, and the beauty of the district would still be standing, unwed, wounded, and near. He understood her completely, and understood worse, that she could not be bought off a wound, that there was no sum and no threat that would answer, because what she wanted was the thing she could only have if Melina fell. You will say nothing further of my bride, Selwyn said very quietly, in any room in this county, or your grace will do what? She smiled, and for the first time let him see the whole of it, the polished malice under the concern, sure of its ground. You cannot unsay what 40 tables have already said. You cannot call a maid a liar, for she has the boot and the gate to shew, and I have heard she will swear to them before the bishop himself if she is asked, and she may well be asked. There is nothing your grace can do to me, for I have done nothing but grieve for a fallen woman, which no law forbids. I shall be at your wedding, your grace. I would not miss it for the world. I shall sit near the front, where I can see the bride come in, and if any there should chance to rise before the vows and ask aloud the question the whole county is asking in whispers, why, that is no doing of mine. I cannot answer for what a shocked county may feel it owes to a house of God. She curtsied again, exactly as deep, and left him standing alone in the little room with the certain settling on him cold and final. She meant to do it at the altar, not before, not in a letter. In the cathedral, in the aisle, with the county banked in their silk to watch, she meant to rise and name his bride a wanton before them all, at the one moment when the shame could never be scrubbed off again. He did not go home. He rode instead to the grey house at the edge of Ackworth in the failing light, not in the brown coat now, but as himself the Duke, meaning to force the door and reach her, and he did not know what, tell her, warn her, stand between her and the morning somehow. But the house, when he came to it, was lit and watchful and full of his uncle's people, and a groom took his horse with a look that told him the tale had reached even here, and when he asked for Miss Hayward he was told, with lowered eyes, that the young lady was not receiving, that the young lady had been told of the trouble that afternoon, that the young lady had asked to be left alone with it, and had not come down. He stood in the hall with his hat in his hand, the Duke of Bramholt, master of every door in the county, and could not get to the one door in it that mattered, and understood that this too was his own building, that he had made himself 2 men, the stranger she would open to and the Duke she would not, and had left the stranger over the wall in the dark with no way back. He wrote her nothing. Whatever he set on paper would be read by other eyes before hers, and would damn her further, and could not carry the one thing that might have steadied her without carrying it to the world as well. So he rode home again through the dark with the whole ruin of it clear before him. And he thought, because he could not help thinking it, of what she was doing in that lit house behind her closed door, alone with the news that she stood accused of the very thing she had wept over 3 nights past. The folly she had named herself and hated herself for and told him to his face was a cruelty done to her, and he thought of what had cost such a woman, who had never in her life learned to be pitied, to be told she was now to be pitied and reviled together, for a lover she had never had, whose only true name was the name of the man she was to marry. He learned before he slept from the footman, who did not know he carried tales, the last turn of it, and it was the turn that finished him, that she had not wept up in her room, nor raged, nor asked to be defended. That she had asked only one thing of the woman set to watch her, whether, if she went home now, tonight, of her own accord, and made no trouble, her father's debts would still be forgiven, and had been told no, that the forgiveness was bound to the marriage and to nothing else, that if she broke the match she broke her father with it, and had gone quiet at that, and thanked the woman, and said that then she would be married in the morning as she had promised, and would walk into the cathedral with her chin up, and let them say what they would say. because a woman who had shod horses at 15 to keep a roof could surely stand up under a little silk and spite for the sake of a dead man's good name, and that she had said one thing more at the last, that the footman had only half heard and repeated because he thought it strange. That whatever befell her in that church, there was a man who had told her once he saw her, out of the rain and out of the dark, and that she meant to hold to it, and did not care who knew it. For it was the truest thing anyone had ever said to her, and she would not be ashamed of it now to save her life. Selwyn sat a long time in the cold and dark of his own room with that in him like a blade, and understood at last, wholly, the thing his cowardice had made. She would walk into the cathedral in the morning holding to the stranger who had wronged her worst of all, defending in her own heart the very man whose folly had built the trap. And she would stand at the altar to be denounced by Rosanna Norcott before the county for a sin whose only author was her bridegroom, and there was one thing only, that could turn the knife in Rosanna's hand to water and clear her before them all and give her back the honor she had never lost, and it was the truth, that the man in the garden was no lover. That the boot was the Duke's, the horse the Duke's, the stranger the Duke himself, come masked and cowardly to the woman he could not stay away from. It would clear her, and it would cost him the whole of the armor 11 years and Cassandra Vere had built. For he would have to stand up in the full sight of the county he had spent his life giving nothing to, and be seen wholly, foolishly, nakedly seen as a man undone by a farrier's daughter, which was the one thing he had sworn no living soul would ever again be permitted to see in him. He found, turning it in the dark, that he did not care, that he would rather be seen and hers than hidden and safe, that the wall he had kept 11 years was worth exactly one grey gown coming up an aisle with its chin level, and not a stone more. He rose before the window had cried and rang for his valet, and stood to be dressed for his wedding with a steadiness he had not felt in days, because the choosing was done, and there is a peace in a thing chosen that no danger can trouble. It would come out today. It would have to. Somewhere across the grey miles Melina Haywood was being laced and pinned, and made ready to walk into a church full of people waiting to destroy her, holding to a stranger's word. And somewhere in that same church Rosanna Norcott would already be settling into her seat near the front in her cream silk, with her question ready and her hour come, and between the two of them, at the head of the aisle, the whole of it now hung upon one thing and one thing only, whether the Duke of Bramholt, who had never in his life let a single soul see the truth of him, could open his mouth in the sight of the county and say it before the wrong mouth said the lie. On the morning of his wedding Selwyn, Duke of Bramholt, stood at the head of the cathedral aisle in a coat the colour of a raven's wing, with the great collar of his house cold across his shoulders and the whole of the county rising in tears behind him, and gave them all precisely nothing. That was the face they knew and feared, the face that had learned 11 years before at Cassandra Vere's white hands, to show the world a shut door and let no draught of feeling under it. They took his stillness for pride, as they always had. Not one among the hundreds packed into the pews under that vaulted stone knew that behind the shut door the Duke of Bramholt was standing over an abyss, listening to his own heart go like a smith's hammer, waiting for the doors at the far end of the nave to open and deliver to him the woman he loved, who did not know that the man she was walking down the aisle to marry was the stranger who had held her rough hand in the dark and told her that someone had seen her. For the trap he had felt drawing tight in the black lane had drawn tighter still. He had learned it only the night before, from the same footman who carried tales without knowing whose ear he filled. Rosanna Norcott had gone to his uncle. She had gone in cream silk and sat very upright and let fall, with the ring of fine glass in her voice, that the Duke's unspoilt bride had been discovered 3 nights since alone in the walled garden at dusk weeping, and that a man had gone over the orchard wall into the lane, and that the servant who lit the lantern had seen the empty place beside her on the bench still warm. She had spent her enemy's evening exactly as Melina had foretold she would. She had time and money to spend on remembering, and she had spent it well. And she meant, so and did not doubt, to spend the rest of it here this morning before all of them in the 1 hour when a woman of no station and no defenders could be broken past any mending. Everything he had built out of cowardice and a brown coat had come down to this: that the truth must come out in the next hour whole, or the one true heart in the kingdom would be branded before the whole county as a spoilt thing and cast off and ruined, and he would have done it to her himself by not speaking sooner. The organ drew its first great breath, and the doors at the west end swung wide, and the light of the summer morning came pouring up the nave, and the whole cathedral turned as one body to look, and Melina Hayward came into the light. Afterward Selwyn could never say what he had expected. The mended grey, perhaps. The farrier's daughter poured against her wool into borrowed finery and made to walk correctly. The plain overlooked creature the county had come to look upon as one looks upon a beggar at a rich man's feast. What came up the aisle toward him was none of it. They had dressed her at last as she ought to have been dressed all her life, in ivory silk that took the light the way the dawn takes it. With her dark hair drawn up and a fall of old lace at her throat that had been his grandmother's, and that his uncle had grudged from the vault only because a duchess must not be married bare. But it was not the silk. He had seen 100 women wear silk. It was that the woman inside it walked up the aisle of that cathedral with the same straight, unhurried, unbeautiful dignity with which she had walked out to a lame horse in the rain, the same set of the chin with which she had thanked a cruel woman for her opinion of the die. And the two things together, the grandeur they had draped upon her, and the grandeur that had always been under it, struck the packed cathedral silent, and then, in one long indrawn breath that ran the whole length of the nave like wind through barley, made it gasp. He heard it. He heard the county gasp. He heard the ladies who had come to sneer at the pauper bride draw in their sneers unspent. He heard the fans stop. He heard, somewhere among the front pews, the small strangled sound of Rosanna Norcott discovering that the plain thing she had come to bury had risen up the aisle looking like the answer to a prayer, and Selwyn, Duke of Bramholt, who had given the world nothing for 11 years, stood at the altar and felt the shut door blow off its hinges, because he was seeing her for the first time, not the stranger's kindness stolen in the rain and the dark, but this woman coming openly up the length of a cathedral in the full light of morning to stand beside him for the rest. Both their lives and the sight of it undid him so completely that his eyes stung, and he did not trouble, before all the county, to hide it. Nearer she came, and nearer, and he was aware, at the edge of himself, of his uncle in the front pew going rigid with satisfaction at the figure his investment had made, of the bishop's patient hands upon the book, of the whole vast machinery of the day grinding on toward its appointed end, while the only thing in the world that mattered walked slowly up its centre. He had spent a fortnight rehearsing every manner in which the truth might be handed to her gently, in private over time, so that it should never land as a cruelty dressed up clever. There was to have been no time now for any of it. Whatever passed in the next quarter hour would pass before 600 watching faces, and he could no more choose the hour of it than a man in a river can choose where to come ashore. She did not know him yet. That was the cruelty still standing between them, and he watched it as she came. She kept her eyes down as a bride is taught, and where her gaze did rise, it went not to the Duke's face but past him to the altar, to the great cold window, to anywhere but the cold proud man she believed was waiting to marry a woman whose eyes he had never troubled to learn. She had come up the aisle to be looked at by strangers, and had steeled herself to be looked at with contempt, and she had no notion at all that the man at the head of it had learned the grey of her eyes in the first hour, and had not stopped seeing them since. But she never reached him. She was perhaps 10 steps from the altar, near enough that Selwyn could see the pulse going in her throat above his grandmother's lace, when Rosanna Norcott rose from the front pew in her cream silk, and stood into the aisle, and stopped the wedding. "Your Grace," her voice rang out clear and beautiful into the vault, pitched to carry, pitched to be remembered. "Before you bind your name to this woman, there is a thing this church must hear, for the honour of your house, which no one else will have the courage to speak." A murmur went through the pews like the first stir of a landslide. Melina had halted where she stood, 3 steps below the altar, her face gone the grey of the sky before rain, and Selwyn saw her understand, with the old animal knowledge of a poor woman, that discovery is never shared out evenly, and that she was about to answer alone for an empty place beside her on a bench. 3 nights ago, Rosanna said, and let the silence hang, and every soul in that cathedral leaned toward it, "This bride, the one you have all come to see married unspoilt, was found off dark in the garden of the house, where she was lodged, weeping, alone." And not alone a moment before, for a man went over the orchard wall into the lane, and left her sitting there with the warmth of him still on the bench. I do not say it gladly. She said it very gladly. I say it because a Duchess of Bramholt must be above such shadows, and this one has walked up your easel out of them. The landslide broke. Gasps, this time not of wonder but of scandal, ran the length of the nave. Heads turned, the fans went up again like a flock of startled birds. And Selwyn saw the whole county in a single sweep, deciding gladly, hungrily, that the plain bride they had been forced for one bright moment to admire was after all only a spoilt pauper who had got above herself, and that here was the true colour of her showing through the dye at last. He saw Melina standing alone in his grandmother's lace with the accusation breaking over her, and he saw her do the only thing to a woman with no defenders. He saw her lift her chin and turn her wet grey eyes up the altar steps to the Duke of Bramholt to take her sentence from him. The cold, proud man who had never learned the colour of her eyes and now had every reason the world could give him to cast her off before all of it. And she looked at Selwyn, and she saw the stranger from the rain and the dark standing where the Duke should be. He watched it strike her. For the length of a breath she did not move at all, and then he saw the seeing come into her, slow and terrible, the way light comes up over a field. The tilt of the head he knew, measured against the memory of a man on a wet road, the set of the mouth. The very way the shoulders stood square to bear a thing. He watched her take the raven collar and the great cold window, and the 600 faces, and set them all aside as a person sets aside the wrapping of a parcel to reach the one thing inside it. He watched the accusation and the whole roaring cathedral go out of her face all at once, the way sound goes out of a room and leave nothing on it but him, the brown coat gone, the lie gone, the plain man from the orchard bench standing at the head of the aisle in the raven collar of the house of Bramholt with his grandmother's lace at her own throat, and he watched her lips part around a word she could not make, and the word was his name, and she did not say it. Because to say it was to fall, and she had never in her life learned how to be caught. She swayed. She put out one rough hand to the air and found nothing there. And Selwyn, Duke of Bramholt, who had stood 11 years at the top of every room giving the world nothing, came down the altar steps at last, 2 of them, and then the 3rd, out of the place where dukes are made to wait, and reached her before she fell, and took the outstretched hand in both of his, the rough, capable, unlovely hand he had held once in the dark, and held it now in the full light before the whole county as a man holds a thing he means never to let be broken. The man who went over the wall, he said, and he did not pitch it to carry as Rosanna had, but the cathedral had gone so silent that it carried to the last pew regardless, was I. For a moment the great church did not breathe at all. I went to that garden, Selwyn said into the silence, still holding Melina's hand, his eyes on hers and not on any of them, as I had gone once before to a rainy road, in a plain coat, with my name left at home, because I am a coward, madam. In the one manner that has ever cost me anything, I have spent 11 years unable to believe that any soul alive would look at the man and not the title, and so I have tested the world in disguise like a suspicious old miser biting every coin, and found it wanting every time until her. Now, at last, he lifted his head and let his gaze go out over the pews, over the risen fans and the open mouths and the hungry, scandalized, avid faces of the county that had come to watch a pauper humbled. And the old shut-door face was gone from him entirely, and something far more terrible to them had taken its place, which was a great man wholly unafraid to be seen feeling. She met a stranger in the rain who could do nothing for her, who she believed to be nobody, with no name and no coach and no living to offer, and she was kind to him and honest with him, and she did not flatter him once, because she did not know there was anything to be got by it. She wept in that garden, madam. His eyes came back to Rosanna Norcott now and held her, and she could not look away and could not bear to look, and stood pinned in her cream silk in the aisle before all her allies with the ground opening under her. She wept because a stranger had been kind to her 3 days before she was to be given, unlooked at and unloved, to the cold, proud Duke of Bramholt. She wept for me. And the man who left the warmth on that bench was the Duke of Bramholt, going home over a wall in the dark, because he had not yet found the courage to tell the only honest woman in England that he had already, God help him, given her his whole heart. It was Rosanna Norcott's ruin, and it was complete, and he did not spare her one grain of it, because she had come to spend a poor woman's honour for sport and had laid it down in the end against nothing at all. The gasp that went through the cathedral now turned as it went, curdling, and turned upon her, The fans that had risen against Melina came slowly, deliciously round to point the other way, and Selwyn saw the front pews, her own allies, her own admiring court, begin one by one to draw the smallest fraction of an inch away from the woman in cream silk. The way a room draws back from something that has been shown all at once to be worthless. She had spent her enemy's evening remembering. She had built her one great stroke out of a warm place on a bench, and the warm place had been the Duke himself, and there was no accusation left in her. And no beauty either that anyone in that church would ever again mistake for the finer thing. The sneering was silenced, wholly and forever, and she sat down into her pew without being bidden, small and grey and finished, and the county let her. But Selwyn had already turned from her, because she was worth nothing to him, and never had been, and the only face in the world he wanted was the one 3 steps below him, wet and astonished and afraid still to believe. He came down the last step and stood before Melina Haywood on the flags of his own cathedral, level with her at last. No altar and no title and no brown coat between them, only the truth he had strangled on for a fortnight now spoken and standing plain in the light. "You said I did not know the colour of your eyes," he said, for her now and not for them, though the silence carried it still. "I learned it in the first hour on the road in the rain. They are the grey of the sky just before it turns to light. I have not stopped seeing them since. I told you a stranger had seen you, and that it was worth more than every yard of silk in that house, and that the man who did not spend the rest of his life glad you were at his table was a fool past all mending." His voice was not steady, and he let it not be steady, before all of them. "I am that fool, Melina. I have been that fool. I came within an hour of losing you to my own cowardice, of standing on those steps and letting them ruin you while I kept my secret one breath too long. I will not do it again. Not for pride. Not for the world. Not for anything it can do to me, which is nothing. I found that out long ago, but only, ever again, for fear of hurting you." She was crying now without pretending not to, the tears bright as they had been in the starlight, and this time she did not have to lie to a servant with a lantern to protect the both of them. There was no one left to protect them from, and the whole county stood witness, and she let it. Her rough hand tightened in his. She looked up at him, not up an idol at a cold, proud man, but into the face of the stranger who had come out of the rain and the dark and turned out, impossibly, to be the very man she had walked in dread to marry. Her mouth trembled toward the beginning of a smile, and Selwyn, Duke of Bramholt, standing shattered and unhidden on the flags of his own church with her hand in both of his, and the wrong at last set right, felt 11 years of the shut door fall away to nothing, and moved the last half-step that remained between them to reach her. The half-step closed, and there was nothing grand in it after all, no swell of the organ and no roll of thunder. Only a man taking a woman's 2 hands into his own in the cold light of a church, while the whole of the county learned at once the thing he had spent a fortnight refusing to let a single soul so much as glimpse. Her fingers were rough in his, work-hardened and honest. The hands of a girl who had once held a horse's hoof against her apron for her father and scrubbed a floor after he was in the ground, and Selwyn held them as though they were the rarest things ever laid into his keeping, because to him, now, they were. He did not care that a bishop stood waiting at his elbow with his book gone slack in his grasp. He did not care that 1,000 eyes had turned from Rosanna Norcott's ruin to feast instead upon his own naked face. He had spent 11 years guarding that face, and he let it be seen, and found the seeing did not kill him. It was Melina who moved first to undo it. She drew a breath, and he felt her fingers loosen in his, felt her try, gently, out of some last stubborn tenderness, to give him back his freedom. "You have done it," she said, very low, so low it was almost only breath meant for him alone, though the great stone silence carried it further than she knew. "You have cleared me before them all, and I will bless you for it to the end of my days. But you need not go on, Selwyn. I will not hold a great man to a bad bargain his uncle struck over his head, nor stand here and watch you spend the whole of your name to pay for a wrong you have already more than mended. I saw what it cost you to speak. Let me go now. Let me go quietly, and keep what peace is left to you." "Peace," Selwyn said. The word came out of him strangely, as though he tasted it and found it had gone to ash. He looked down at her upturned face, wet still and pale and braced, even now, for the blow she was so used to being dealt, and something in him that had been clenched shut since a woman named Cassandra Vere had wept her beautiful bought tears at his bedside broken at last and did not close. You would give me back my peace, he said. Melina, you do not know what it is you offer me. My peace was a shut door in an empty house. My peace was 11 years of wanting nothing, so that nothing could ever again be taken from me. I called it strength. I let this county call it pride, and I let it, because a shut door frightens men and a broken one only makes them pity you. His voice was not steady. He heard it fail, heard the fine cold instrument of it crack in the middle of a word, and he did not master it, though a fortnight ago he would sooner have died. You did not knock at that door. You did none of the things a woman schooled to catch a duke would do. You stood in the mud of a market and would not let a stranger's axle go unmended. You met me in a brown coat and a borrowed horse, and you were kind to a man you thought had nothing, and you asked me nothing, and you flattered me not at all. And by the time I knew what you had done to me, the door was already off its hinges and I was standing in the wind. He tightened his hands about hers so that she could not draw them free. I do not want my peace. I want you, not to save you, not to pay a debt. God knows you are the one soul in this church who never once presented me with a bill. I want the thing you gave a stranger on a wet road without knowing his rank or his fortune or his name. I want the chance to be a man to you and not a coronet. That is the whole of it, and I will say it before every mouth in Ackworth and be glad. There was a stir behind him then, a heavy scrape of a pew, and a voice he knew came thick and appalled across the aisle. Selwyn. Lord Auberonvane had heaved himself to his feet, his broad face gone the colour of tallow, one hand splayed upon the pew back as though the church itself had begun to pitch beneath him. Selwyn, in the name of God, you forget yourself, you forget what you are. This creature, a farrier's daughter, a coal heiress with the coal and none of the heiress left to her, a thing that grubs in market mud, this is what you would set at the head of Bramholt, before the whole county? There is a bargain struck, nephew, and a reason for the striking of it, and the notes upon this house will fall due the very hour you play the fool at that altar, and then where is your 400 years? Sit down. Sit down and speak the words and be silent, and thank me after as you were bred to. Once that voice would have moved him. Once the weight of 400 years and a mortgaged house and a family name would have settled upon Selwyn like a stone lid, and he would have bent to it, because he had long ago stopped believing there was anything on that lid worth the trouble of keeping. He turned now, slowly, with Melina's hand still fast in his, and he looked at his uncle across the flags, and he was not angry. That was the strange thing he would remember after. He was not angry at all. You told me once, uncle, that sentiment beggared this family, he said. His voice had steadied. It carried to the last dark corner of the nave. You told me my father married for love and drank the difference, and that I should marry for sense, and thank you when Bramholt still stood. Well, here is your sense then. Let the notes fall due. Let the banks refuse the name. Let the roof come off the great hall, and the deer run wild in the park, and every stone of it go one by one to the creditors, and I will stand in the ruin of it a happier man than I have been in 11 years under a sound roof, because I will not be alone in it. You have kept the accounts a dozen years, and you have balanced everything in this house, but the one column that was ever worth the ink, and I am done being a figure in your ledger. I am not for sale, uncle. Neither, thank God, was she, whatever you paid for her. There is no coin in England that could have bought me what she gave me for nothing. Auberon's mouth worked, and no sound came from it. He looked about him for the allies a man of his sort always assumes are at his shoulder, and found, as Rosanna Norcott had found a quarter hour before him, that the county had already begun its silent, ruthless arithmetic, and had struck his name from the reckoning. A duke who would beggar himself for love is a scandal. A duke who declares before the assembled gentry that he would sooner keep the woman than the house is, they were discovering all at once, something else entirely. Something that made a fat schemer clutching at a mortgage look very small and very cold. Lord Auberonvane sat down. He was not bidden to, any more than Rosanna had been. He simply understood at last and too late that there was no longer any room in that church for what he was, and he lowered himself into his pew and was, from that moment, a man of no consequence in the story of Bramholt, which he had thought for a dozen years was his to write. Selwyn turned back to her. The whole of it hung now, as it had hung all along, upon one face and no other. You have not answered me, he said gently only to her. I have made my claim before them all. It is your turn to refuse me, Melina, if you will. And if you refuse me, I will bear it, for I have earned it. But do not refuse me to save me. I have had a bellyful of being saved from feeling. Refuse me only if you do not want the man, not the Duke. I know you never wanted the Duke. You dreaded him, and you were right to. The man on the road. The one who told you he had seen you. Do you want him? For a long moment she did not speak, and Selwyn, who had faced down creditors and duellists and the deaths of everyone he had ever let himself love without so much as changing colour, discovered that his heart was beating like a boy's against his ribs, and that he could not breathe until she answered. I told a footman with a lantern, Melina said at last, and her voice trembled and steadied and trembled again, that a man had told me once he saw me, out of the rain and out of the dark, and that I meant to hold to it though it cost me my life in this church today. I did not know when I said it that the man was you. I thought I was holding to a stranger I should never see again, and that I would walk up this aisle and marry a cold, proud lord and comfort myself the rest of my days with the memory of 1 hour when somebody looked at me and did not find me wanting. The tears came freely down her face now, and she let them, before all of them, as she had let nothing in all her hard-used life. And now you tell me they were the same man, that the stranger and the Duke I dreaded were one. Do you know what that is, Selwyn? It is not a bargain forgiven. It is not a name to hide behind. It is the 1 hour I meant to live on forever, turned into a whole life. Yes, God help me, yes. I do not want your house, and I never wanted your rank, and I would take you in the ruin of it as gladly as at the head of it. I want the man. I have wanted him since the road. Selwyn, Duke of Bramholt, bowed his head over rough hands, and for the first time since a grave in the north country had closed over a wife who never loved him and a child who never breathed, wept openly, and was not ashamed and did not care who watched. It was the bishop, recovering himself, who brought them back. He came a hesitant step forward, his book still slack in his hands, and cleared his throat, and looked from the weeping Duke to the trembling bride to the vast frozen congregation as a man might look who finds the world he thought he understood has been remade in a quarter of an hour, and no one has told him the new rules. Your Grace, he ventured. That is, the service. If it is to go forward, there are words yet unspoken. Then let us speak them, Selwyn said, and lifted his head, and his voice was wet and unsteady, and it did not matter in the least. But hear me, Bishop, and let the whole county hear it, so that no soul in this shire is ever again in the smallest doubt of it. I do not take this woman to save my house. I do not take her because a note was signed, or an uncle willed it, or a season passed her over and made her cheap. I take her because she is the finest heart I have met in 38 years of a hard and guarded life, and because I was fool enough and coward enough to nearly lose her, and because a man is given, if he is very fortunate, one chance in this world to stop being afraid. And she is mine. He turned then, deliberately, with Melina's hand raised in his, and faced the pews, the cream silks, and the point-fang fans, and the whole assembly that had come to watch a farrier's daughter destroyed for their morning's sport. You gasped when she came up this aisle, he said, because you thought her transformed. She is not transformed. She is only at last seen. She was this all along, in the mud and in the threadbare cloak. While you looked over her heads at your own reflections, I looked over her head too. I very nearly did not stop. Whatever you take from this day, take that. The finest thing in the room is very often the one you have all agreed to overlook, and there is no silk in England can make it, and no sneer can unmake it, and the only fool in this church this morning was the man now proudest to marry her. He faced the altar again. He spoke the words a bishop gave him, and meant every one, and when it came to her turn, Melina spoke hers in a voice that grew stronger with each syllable, the voice of a woman who had been told her whole life to be quiet and had just been told, before a cathedral full of her betters, that she need never be quiet again. And when the bishop, gathering courage from somewhere, pronounced them man and wife, there was a silence, and then, from somewhere in the great cold vault of the place, a single pair of hands began to clap an old dowager. It was said afterward, who cared nothing for Rosanna Norcott, and had disliked Auberon Vane for 40 years and then another, and then the whole of Ackworth Cathedral was on its feet and roaring, the very people who had come to watch her broken now beating their palms raw in her honor. Because a crowd loves nothing on earth so well as the moment it decides to have been on the right side all along, Selwyn scarcely heard them. He had eyes for one face, and he bent, there at the altar of his fathers, and kissed his wife, and the last stone of an 11-year wall came down inside him without a sound. Of Rosanna Norcott little more need be told. She left Ackworth before the bells had done ringing, and left the shire not long after, and the county that had once hung upon her word discovered it could pass a whole season without troubling to remember her name. The woman who had built her one great stroke out of a warm place on a bench found that the world she had ruled by fear has no memory at all for those who cease to frighten it. As for the other ghost, the beautiful one that had walked at Selwyn's shoulder for 11 years, the memory of Cassandra Vere, and her costed tears, and the coronet she had loved better than the man he found, as that first summer went on, that he had stopped meeting her in the corners of the house. A heart cannot hold both a wound and a wife, it seems, if the wife is the right one, and hers had healed his so quietly that he could not have named the day the ache went out of it. They did not, as it happened, lose the house. Old Hayward's notes proved to have passed, on his death, into kinder hands than Auberon Vane had let his nephew believe, and were forgiven not for a marriage of convenience but as a gift to a marriage plainly made of something better. And what the creditors did not forgive, the Duke of Bramholt, no longer a recluse hoarding his griefs in the north, set himself to earn back with a diligence that astonished a county which had thought him too proud to trouble. But that was the labour of years, and it is not the picture worth the keeping. Picture worth the keeping is a smaller one, and it belongs to an evening the following autumn, when the great hall at Bramholt had its fires lit again, and its long table full for the first time in a generation. Selwyn sat at the head of it and did a thing he had done nearly every evening since the spring, which was to say very little and watch his wife. Melina had the coheiress's head for figures and the farrier's daughter's plain sense, and she had taken the wreck of the estate's accounts in hand as easily as she had once taken a broken axle, and half the tenants already brought their troubles to the Duchess before ever they thought to trouble the Duke. She was laughing now at something the old steward had said, her rough, capable hand resting a moment on the man's sleeve, entirely unaware that at the far end of his own table her husband had stopped attending to anything in the world but her. She caught him at it, as she always did. She looked down the length of the shining table, past the candles and the restored plate and the guests, and found his eyes on her, and did not look away, and something passed between them along that stretch of polished oak that no one else in the bright hall could see or name the whole of it. The road and the rain and the market mud, the brown coat and the grey gown, the ale and the gasp and the shut door thrown wide. Her mouth curved. She lifted her glass to him, half an inch, the smallest private salute, the way a woman salutes the one person who ever truly saw her. And Selwyn, Duke of Bramholt, who had once taught himself to want nothing because wanting had only ever taught him grief, raised his own glass to the woman the whole world had agreed to overlook, and held her eyes across the length of the life they had so nearly missed, and wanted everything, and was afraid of none of it, and was at last and for all his days, exactly where he had spent 11 years swearing he would never again allow himself to be, which was to say, entirely, gladly, and forever hers.